What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my first impressions of Warhammer 40k Chaos Gate Daemonhunters, or Daemonhunters, which is an absolute mouthful of a title, but basically I'm taking a look at this game because I cover a lot of TRPGs, CRPGs, etc., and this was pretty heavily requested since it released quite recently, so people were looking for my opinions on it, so I decided to go ahead and review it, though I admit I was not initially planning to do so. And that is largely because of this relevant point, which is that I don't know a lot about Warhammer 40k, which I realize is a bit of nerd blasphemy, but as a channel who covers pretty extensively Pathfinder and things like Dungeons and Dragons, all of my Pathfinder knowledge in particular came at the cost of having to ignore other things, let's say. So Warhammer 40k is admittedly something I just don't know a lot about. So truthfully, my first impressions of this game are just kind of learning about Warhammer 40k a little bit. I knew little snippets, like I knew what the Imperium of Man was, which is like the faction you pretty much play as here, and I'm aware of a few other tiny things, but largely I was pretty lost. But one of the things that really stood out to me playing through this was that while the story seems to take itself very seriously, some of the animations seem almost intentionally humorous, and I don't know if this is just a stylistic choice or if that's something they do a lot for Warhammer 40k, because in my experience, or at least what I had heard about Warhammer 40k, always seemed very serious, whereas in this game, the story is very serious, but the animations, again, are almost a little comical, even if they are a little gory at the same time. From there, let's actually jump in and talk about the game a little bit. So in the prologue, we actually see a big commander of the Imperium of Man get destroyed by a demon, and we take over his spot as the commander of a ship called the Baleful Edict. This is the ship that serves as our central hub. We can upgrade it, as well as all of our Space Marines, or I should say our elite Special Forces Space Marines, who happen to be called the Grey Knights. While our character is never specifically shown, we recruit a bunch of these knights, take them on missions against this plague known as the Bloom, which it's my understanding is caused by a chaos god known as Nurgle. And so far, playing the game for a handful of hours, this has been a pretty solid experience. The story is presented in a fairly compelling way, albeit I have to admit, going with a sort of plague-based story right after an actual global pandemic seems like a roll of the dice, but seems to be working out for them. Now, the actual combat has been a pretty interesting experience so far, because from a tactics and system standpoint, the system itself is pretty simple, but if anything, I think that actually kind of helps it out, because of all the various Grey Knights you get, there are several classes of which they can be, which grant them special abilities. However, those special abilities are in addition to the sort of base abilities that everyone gets, but their class will often give them access to their psychic powers, as Grey Knights apparently are genetically modified super soldiers that, with the aid of a resource known as willpower, are able to use those psychic abilities. But while the actual in-game combat can be relatively simple, using those psychic abilities and just your enemies in general can cause what's known as a warp surge. It's my understanding that the warp is some sort of alternate reality, but with the use of psychic abilities, etc., it can kind of cause a surge, as they call it in-game, which will then give random effects to the battlefield, usually detrimental to you. And in addition to these things, some of the things that we can unlock and upgrade on the Baleful Edict as we slowly repair the ship as it gets damaged in the beginning of the game, gives us more access to abilities and things we can do to kind of alter the playing field, so to speak. And in that regard, the combat, in my experience so far, has been simple to learn while managing to retain a decent amount of depth, at least here at the beginning. I think going forward, as I move to review this thing, I think what I'm going to pay attention to a great deal, beyond just, the standard what's getting presented story and choice-wise, is how deep this combat system actually gets. Because at the beginning of the game, at least, all of the combat encounters are pretty short and sweet. You're kind of dumped into a small arena, you'll have to travel it a tiny bit, but even this is done in turn-based mode, as the maps themselves really aren't that large. You have a couple of combat encounters, and that's it, mission over. So I'm curious how much that's going to expand, or if the entire game just kind of stays short, sweet, and to the point, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, because in the case of this game, when I get around to doing the review after 100%, I'm going to have to play through it at least a couple times. But to wrap this up, and so I don't ramble on for too terribly long, my first impressions of Warhammer 40k Chaos Gate Daemonhunters is pretty positive, actually. The story's been pretty compelling. I think it simultaneously, again, has a few comical animations that I think kind of help break up the seriousness a little bit. And despite at times definitely seeming seeming a little over the top, it nonetheless is interesting as I'm learning a lot of stuff about Warhammer 40k. Again, the combat is to the point and doesn't overstay its welcome or manage to be too tedious while retaining a certain amount of tactical depth, and so far I'm having a pretty good time. And I guess more than anything, I'll have to see how that changes over the course of playing the game, because before I wrap this up, the main thing that stands out to me here is that Chaos Gate is $45, which, as I've expressed in the past, is a little steep in my opinion for most TRPGs. However, depending on the depth of the story and just kind of how things expand, etc., and how long the game actually winds up being, my mind may change on that. But just at a bare bones glance, I thought $45 seemed like a lot for this game, but to be fair, I did just come off the back of another TRPG recently, so I'm trying not to let that particular experience cloud my judgment of this one. But that's kind of where I'm at right now, guys. Overall, though, enjoying the experience, and I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly just thank you so much for watching. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.